Hello, I'm Laura Marling and welcome to Reversal of the Muse. This is a podcast, a series of conversations with people that I know or people actually that I hadn't met before about gender and creativity and the environment in which we are making music. So I've spoken to a lot of engineers and producers and female musicians and women who run guitar shops and such. It's been brilliant and I've really enjoyed all these conversations. Coming up in the series, we have some really great people, including Haim and Karen Elson, Catherine J. Marks, who's a fantastic producer. And today I'm speaking with Vanessa Parr, who for some time was an in-house engineer at the Village Studios in LA. And she trained at Berklee College of Music, as you'll hear. And she was actually the first person that I spoke to in this series. I was looking for people to talk to about their experience of working in studios, and her name came up a lot. I found her email address and sent her an email, and she very kindly came over to my garage in Highland Park, and we had a really interesting chat. And she challenged a lot of kind of the biases that I was leaning on for the basis of the rest of the conversations that I was planning to have about this podcast. And so I'm really glad that I spoke to her first. And we talk about the more technical side of training and why there aren't more women training to work in studios, and whether it's easier to learn from women to women, and also about the advantages of being a woman in a studio. I've never, or very, very rarely have I walked into the studio and not been the only woman. Is that right? Yes. I most often walk in and I'm the only woman. And that's fine. I've never suffered any great disadvantage to that effect, but I'm wondering whether we are missing an aspect of creativity if we are missing something about female creativity and a safe space, much as that's a very overly familiar phrase to us now. What effect that's having on us. Anyway, that's enough of my incomprehensible rambling. I leave it much more up to my guests in the podcast, as you'll hear. Anyway, that's it from me. I hope you enjoyed. There's many more to come, and come and see us again at Reversal of the Muse. Today I'm talking to Vanessa Parr, who is an engineer, and she's proper, and I've never met her before. I've only spoken to her over email, so I'm very excited to meet her and ask her what her experience of working in what is certainly a male-dominated job market. She's been doing it for, I think, 10 years, and she's been on some amazing records, including T-Bone Burnett and the Civil Wars, Elton John, can you tell I'm reading this from a list? John Mayer, Lisa Marie Presley, Steve Earle, Jeff Bridges. Oh, Jeff Bridges has got a record. There you go. Hello.
Hi.
Okay, so we are in my garage in Highland Park, and I've asked Vanessa to have a conversation with me because I don't often meet female engineers.
Sure.
I'm sure you're used to having that said every time someone walks into a studio.
Yeah, not too many. More and more these days than there have been when I first started. But
is that right?
Yeah, definitely.
Why do you think that is?
I think it just takes time. I think when I was in school studying engineering, there were maybe 6 girls in my department. And as the school grew and the department grew, more and more people got attracted to it. And I think it's just like anything. It's similar to what's going on in the film industry, where there's more and more female directors and cinematographers and producers, but it just takes time because people have to get trained and, all that good stuff.
You studied audio engineering?
Yeah.
And were you one of 6 girls?
Like between 6 and 10, I think, in my year. Yeah.
And how many was there on the course?
In the course, maybe 200.
Okay.
Yeah. So it was pretty small. I mean, we were all kind of used to, to backtrack, I went to Berklee because I was a singer and I just wanted to go to music school and I wanted to get out of Virginia, which is where I'm from. So I ended up going to Berklee, and it ended up being very different than I expected, and I enjoyed it, but I just took a lot of introductory classes and sort of found engineering to be interesting. At the time when I was at Berklee, it was like 30% female. So you were already used to being in the minority there. So that was not anything new. And, when you're 18, you're like, ooh, that's kind of fun. But so, yeah, I think it did take a little bit of adjusting. But for my personality, it was okay because I was never a super girly girl. So it was easier for me to kind of adjust to being in the male environment.
Yeah. Do you think that the nature of the job is, you say you're not a girly girl. Do you think that being in a studio, being interested in engineering is an inherently more masculine thing than it is feminine?
I don't know. I mean, I would like to say not, because I'd like to think that those types of stereotypes don't really exist. But at the same time, maybe the fact that there aren't a lot of women doing it is evidence to the fact that it is a little bit more. Mm-hmm. And I don't know that it's masculine, more that it's technical. And it's very long hours, and you have to put up with a lot. Same like as an artist, it's like there's a lot of rejection and there's a lot of stuff you just kind of have to take on the chin and get over. And I think sometimes I think girls are too smart to put themselves through that, but like most girls are like, oh no, I'm not doing that. But so I'm not entirely sure why. I mean, I guess you could say it's similar to there not being as many female film editors or animators or mechanical engineers or things of that nature. They're just, for some reason, a job that attracts more men than women. But,
right.
Yeah.
I mean, that's totally viable.
Yeah. I'd like that to not be true, but it just kind of seems to be the way that it is. But I think it's changing. And I have a lot of clients that appreciate a more female presence in the room. But I think part of the reason girls who are a little more tomboyish sort of fit in is that you have to kind of fit into the palling around. You have to be someone that people want around, that they don't feel like they're going to say the wrong things and piss off or, anything like that. So I think maybe that's part of the reason too.
Do you consider that a compromise?
I do now more than I used to. I think in the beginning I was just trying to fit in a lot more. Now if something bothers me, I'll speak up for it. But in the beginning, when I didn't have any clients or any work, I felt like I had to kind of just put up with whatever happened,
And to an extent, that's part of everybody's life, isn't
exactly.
it? And the more that you know yourself, the more you're like, no, actually, that's something I won't stand for.
Yeah, and it's hard because you don't want to be a spoil sport. Like, you have to make allowances for people and their stories, and especially when you work in music, and a lot of people are significantly older than you. Like when I started, everyone that I worked with was at least 20 years older than me. So it's like people come from different places, and that's okay. And you can't make an issue out of everything. Yeah. But if you feel like you're really being compromised, then I think you have to say something. So yeah, that line's different for everybody.
Yes, totally. I've found in my experience of quite often being the youngest in studios and the only girl that I was also really shy when I started, and I wasn't in the same position as you, but I was like really young as well, 17-year-old. And I found the whole environment really old manly.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I've definitely worked with a lot of. When I started working at the Village, I think I got put on a lot of sessions with female artists because they thought like, oh, well, you're a woman and they're a woman, so you all get along great. And I think that there are a lot of women that kind of when they start are easily intimidated by the surroundings, and over time they find their voice and they learn how to speak up. But I think that's common. I mean, the whole thing is intimidating, really, especially when, you see artists come in and they're working with producers they maybe never thought that they'd get to work with, and musicians they never thought they'd get to work with. And so they feel like,
Right, so you noticed that
Oh, yeah,
artists.
Completely, yeah.
That's interesting.
But they get over it,
Yeah. Phew.
And before you know it.
They're nightmares like everyone else.
No.
Let's backtrack a bit, because I did ask you just before we turned on the mics how long you've been an engineer, and you were beginning to tell me what led you to working in LA.
Yeah, no, let's see, I started studying, I think at 19 in the engineering program at Berkeley, and I graduated in 2004, and I packed up my car and I drove across country, and I knew I wanted to work at the Village because they were doing a lot of rock and roll, which at the time I was interested in. And so I just kept dogging them and calling them and setting up interviews, and eventually I got hired. And I started as a runner, and so I got coffee and tea and lunches, and I cleaned rooms and all that kind of stuff. And after about 6 months working there, I got into a car accident, and I totaled my car. And so I had to pay to fix it. So I started answering phones as well. So I was running and I was answering phones. And I think because I was working so much, they felt like they owed me something a little bit. So they threw me a bone, they threw me a studio. And a session, excuse me. And so they threw me on a session, and that went well. And then they gave me another session, and that went well. And then one of the assistants left, and I got trained up quite early. I only ran for about a year, which is pretty small in the scheme of things. And I was lucky that I got the first big session I got put on was the T-Bone Burnett session. And so I got trained by really good people. And I worked as an assistant at the Village for close to 10 years. And in between that, doing engineering as well, but assisting engineering and kind of making my own clients and my own connections and eventually going freelance. So
yeah, right. So for those people who don't know how the career of an engineer goes, some engineers become completely freelance engineers, and they usually associate themselves with one particular producer or a couple of producers.
Yeah. A lot of times engineers will attach themselves to producers or vice versa, just because for obvious reasons it's nice to work with the same person.
Yeah.
So the route that I went is very traditional. It's interesting though, because you get the opportunity to work with people. When you go straight freelance, you're working on a lot of smaller projects, but with the hope that you don't ever have to work for somebody else. You know. But when you work at for a studio, you're working for somebody, but you also work with higher level clients and producers and engineers. And so I've worked with some really amazing people, even though I wasn't independent.
Yeah.
And so it gives you an opportunity to make those connections, and so that's really valuable.
Yeah.
So now there are producers that know me that because of where I worked, and whereas if I had never worked at a large studio, those connections would have been so much harder to make.
So when people come by a studio producer, they bring their own engineer, you are in there, you know that room already, and you can show them how to use it.
Yeah, I'm like I call myself, in that scenario, I would call myself like a technical liaison. So I set everything up. They tell me what they're thinking, and then knowing what I know about the spaces, I figure out how everything's going to get set up, patch all the mics, the gear, and then you hang out and make sure that nothing goes wrong. If it does, if you fix it, set more stuff up, tear stuff down, order lunches, foods, all that kind of stuff. So you just sort of act as a liaison for the studio, basically. Right. And then a lot of times you wind up engineering because they need somebody else, and you're there, so they throw you in. So it's definitely an older way to go about it, but for me, I needed that. I needed that education, I guess.
Yeah. Yes. Baptism by fire.
Exactly.
So I assume that you learnt mostly from men.
Yeah.
In your college.
Yeah, I had one teacher, Terry Becker, who was an engineer, and she passed away, I think, in 2005. But she was a wonderful, wonderful engineer, and so she was definitely kind of a mentor. And when I moved out here, she helped me get a job interview and gave me a lot of advice about interviews and things like that. So I was very grateful to have her perspective, because especially being an engineer, a female engineer in the 70s, would have been, as hard as it was for me, it would have been a lot harder for her. So she was great. And but for the most part, I've learned a lot from men.
Is there a difference, do you find, learning from men and from women?
Not really. I mean, personally, Terry was very old school. So she had a way of just kind of looking at you, and when you said something that wasn't right, and you were kind of like, you kind of cower in your seat. And so she had that presence of knowledge that a lot of male engineers have, and yet was very feminine at the same times, but could still inspire that desire to please her, impress her, And I found that good teachers are, kind of like good parents. They're people that you want to approve of you. So whether they're male or female, I think that's just the characteristic that makes a good teacher. I learned a lot actually from my husband. When I first started working, I shadowed him a lot, and he was at the time, he was the head assistant, a very competent engineer, and now he's a very successful engineer on his own, but he's a very good teacher. So I've just been lucky to find people that are good at explaining stuff.
Yes.
Which is what I need, and then I can come back with my questions and be like, all right, so.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, at the time, there weren't any other female engineers working at the studio.
Are there now?
No. I have assisted... I've assisted Leslie Ann Jones and a really great engineer that lives around here, Lynn Earls. And we've had when I was at the Village, a number of female runners that have expressed an interest in becoming assistants, but they either did it on their own by leaving and going off and doing their own thing, or they sort of changed paths. So I haven't seen another woman become an assistant at the Village yet.
Right.
But it will happen.
Have you ever seen a female producer?
No.
Yeah,
that's kind of crazy.
Isn't that crazy? I'm trying to still put my finger on this, and I guess this series of conversations that I'm having with people from many women from many dimensions of studio. is to just open up that, to figure out that mystery.
Yeah.
Is it that it's not, it's just not a space suited to women, or is it just that there hasn't been an environment where, is it because there's not a female dominant environment in which women can sort of reign?
I really wish that there was. I mean, I know that there are female producers out, and I've met Linda Perry, and obviously there's people out there that are doing it, but I can't quite put my finger on why. I mean, maybe some of it has to do with, especially nowadays, with as competitive as everything is, the people that are actually getting hired to produce records, and not just people making them at home, are people with a lot of experience, and that takes time. And if those women don't have that experience yet, they may not find themselves in a position to be able to do that. Yeah. So it might be that in 15 years we'll see more. I'd like that. Yeah. Wouldn't that be? It would be nice.
I just made a record with Blake Mills. He's a great musician, blah blah blah, great producer and great human being in general. But he has been. His knowledge of studios is amazing because he's been a session musician since he was 16. Yeah. So not only is he super comfortable in studios and also know how everything works, but he's also knows a lot of people who have been working in studios. So
sure,
it was interesting to watch him in a studio environment, totally at ease. Whereas studios for me are a place of anxiety, which is so silly because my parents ran a studio, so I shouldn't. It's not that foreign to me. But I have been thinking a lot about how I would feel in a studio run by women. I don't know what it looks like even, so I'm trying to get that together. But whether there's a uniquely feminine approach to recording.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I know that men and women hear differently. Like for sure, I think that's true.
That's right, isn't it? That's scientifically right.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that's interesting. And I make jokes about it, but sometimes, if I'm working with people, it's like, I don't know if you're deaf or it's because I'm a woman, but it's can you hear that? Like, are you hearing that? No, I can't hear that. But I think women here have a lot more detail in their higher range than men do. But also, a lot of the engineers I work for or producers I work for have just been doing it for 30 years and they've lost a lot of hearing. I mean, that's just part of the job. And it's interesting to me that a lot of studios are run by women. There's a lot of female studio managers. So somewhere in there is that feminine connection, but it doesn't extend to being in the room. And perhaps part of that has to do with the hours that you work, and it's really not realistic to have a family if you're an engineer or if you're a producer. I mean, I think that's got to be a big part of it. For the female engineers I've met, I haven't met one with kids. Because somebody's, there's a sacrifice there on somebody's end.
Yes.
And it's so maybe that has something to do with it. The Village, we've had a lot of female technicians. Right. And our boss is very conscientious of trying to hire as many women as you can. But to a certain extent, you can only do so much. You can't give people the desire to do it. They have to want it themselves. So
yes, exactly. There was a big push in England a couple of years ago to get more women to choose science at university. Yeah. And it was phenomenally successful because the extension had never been made before in such a formal way. And it sounds sort of silly and crass to think that women wouldn't think to choose science in this day and age, But it was science and engineering, technical engineering, was just not something that, the hand just had to be offered to them and then right.
I like this.
Yeah, cool, great.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's some element of that here. But actually that practical thing about, because you're totally beholden to whoever you're working with hours, aren't you?
Yes. And there's a certain amount of surrender that you just have to accept. There's no way out but through. So you kind of have to just get through it. Aww. And there's days where you really want to go home and you can't, but I think that's hard. And that my husband and I were just talking about this. There's a very specific personality type of people that will allow themselves to be in that situation. Male or female, and it's to be very put upon, and to that kind of warlike mentality of we're all in this together, nothing on the outside matters, we just got to get this done, and people get addicted to that. They crave that.
They do. I've seen so many people addicted to studio.
Yeah. So many people that just don't want to go home, and it's easy to ignore everything that's going in on the outside, when you're in there. So I see that, and maybe that's part of it. More women just don't want to do that. I don't know. don't blame him, but
yes. But what if it was like, I'm really labouring this point now, but what, I wouldn't want to be stuck in a studio till 2:00 in the morning, much as I love my male surroundings as I have, but maybe I'd be more inclined to if it was a feminine environment or something.
Sure.
That smelled a bit nicer.
Yeah, it's the other thing I always tell people. I smell nicer. No, I think it's nice to have another woman around, but I have a lot of women around usually, So I don't find myself missing that often, which I'm very fortunate, to be in that situation, because even working at the Village, even though when I worked there, I was the only assistant, there were so many women that were employed there. So it's not like I couldn't step out and talk to another girl,
Right.
Maybe in my session that was the case, but there still was a female presence to that place. And that's not the case at every studio. I think ours was
certainly
unusual.
not in my experience.
Yeah. I think I was lucky in that regards. Or even still, if I work on a T-Bone project, his assistant is a woman who's a friend of mine. So, we chat. And so I've got that going on. You know what I mean? Or this other producer I've been working with lately, Larry Klein, tends to work with female artists. And I don't know if that's by design or if it's just been the pattern that I've seen the last couple of years. But so there's always women running around.
Yeah.
They're not doing what I'm doing, but they're there, and that's comforting.
That's nice.
Yeah.
It sounds like I just need to record at the Village.
That's
then
right, yeah.
then all my anxieties will be over.
Well, that's interesting because there's a comfort level, and I think some artists want that comfort level of something familiar, and some artists want to show off. There's a difference. So I've worked with some female artists where I feel like they would prefer actually to have a young, cute guy assisting because it gives them someone to flirt with and perform for. It's like,
Yeah.
Then there are some women who it makes them so much more comfortable to have another woman there. So
right.
It just depends.
That is so interesting. I had not thought about that. Because there is I guess I've actually benefited from a certain amount of vulnerability induced by being sort of under a male gaze in some way.
Yeah.
And I've thrived off that. That's weird. I hadn't even thought about that.
Yeah.
And later on this afternoon, I'm having a conversation with the Pierces, and I was having a preliminary lunch with them the other day, and we were talking about what we might talk about. And I was like, don't you find it easier to learn from women? Because we were talking about guitar lessons.
Right.
And Alison, the older one, was like, yeah, maybe. And then the younger one, Catherine, was like, no, because when I make a mistake with a man, I can be like, oh, sorry, and be all cute or whatever, and then move on, and it's adorable. And I was like, that's totally valid and true.
It's so valid, and I mean, I'm 33 now. When I started working in studios, I was 22, and so I was really young, and I was young and cute and all that, and you have to use whatever advantages you have. If you're young and even somewhat attractive, use that to your advantage, because it's all about getting information, and Lord knows people use other things to their advantage. They use their relationships, their family, whatever connections that they have. And if it makes it easier for you to get information from somebody because you're a girl, I mean, you're not hurting anybody. You know what I mean? Even though I experienced a certain amount of hazing in the studios, I think the attitude and sort of the demeanor of being kind of a young girl will help you get more information out of people. And people are more willing to give you a shot. They're or to have you around. And there's nothing wrong with that, because in the long run, if you're not good at what you do, it'll show.
Yeah.
And then you won't be there anymore.
Yeah.
But if you are good, then you've got a job. So, I think when you're a girl and you work in a male-dominated environment and you get promoted, people are going to assume that it may have happened for other reasons, or there's definitely, I remember having some friction with some people, but at the end of the day, I know the truth, and the truth is, if I wasn't good at my job, it wouldn't matter how cute I was, or how, you know what I mean? Or if I was a girl, they would fire me. So you have to just kind of shrug that off and move forward.
Yeah, right. I like the idea that, where there's maybe some compromise, there's also some benefit.
Sure, of course.
You might sort of be the victim of some sort of unfortunately randomly sexist joke, but you also might get some other advantage.
People remember you. I mean, that is really important, because people go to studio and they get some variation of the same dude on every session. If you're a girl, you stand out.
Yeah,
it's
that's
really I mean, that's valuable, in a business that's that competitive, to be remembered that way. There will always be people that will never feel really comfortable around women, and you have to understand that that's not your problem, it's theirs.
Yeah.
It's usually a generation gap. It's usually people that just see them as fundamentally different.
Mm-hmm.
But, you you just don't work with those people. It's really easy.
Well, that's fantastic. Well, we've covered a lot of bases. Thank you so much for coming to talk to me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
And I hope I get to work with you someday.
Yes, please call me.
Right.